Hello, and welcome back to the 13th installment in a series of videos about the history of Japanese prints and the collection of Japanese works on paper at the Honolulu Museum of Art. I'm Steven Salel, the curator of Japanese art. In our previous video, we talked about the work of Katsushika Hokusai and the way in which two highlights of his oeuvre, his multi-volume sketchbooks known as Hokusai Manga, and his folio of single-sheet prints entitled 36 Views of Mount Fuji, reveal his interest in documenting as extensively as possible visual aspects of the world in which he lived. Here we will discuss Utagawa Hiroshige, who was born more than 30 years after Hokusai, but died only about 10 years after the other artist. As two of the most accomplished print designers of early 19th century Japan, therefore, they were rivals whose competition led to the production of some of the most celebrated landscape prints in the history of ukiyo-e. In addition to Hokusai, Hiroshige's prints responded to precedents established by earlier artists as well. In a recent video, we described how Suzuki Harunobu and other artists of the late 18th century established a foundation for the genre of landscape prints with works such as the 8 Views of Omi. Published around 1834, Hiroshige's version of the 8 Views of Omi is an extraordinary achievement. In the decades after Harunobu's publication, the field of Nishikie printing underwent a dramatic technical evolution, including the addition of synthetic pigments such as ferrocyanide, known more commonly as Prussian blue. Just as Hokusai had used it extensively in his Great Wave and other prints in the 36 Views of Mount Fuji, here Hiroshige uses Prussian blue in the sky and in the waters of Lake Biwa. What is particularly remarkable about these works by Hiroshige is the extent to which he utilizes the Western concept of chiaroscuro to delineate the landscape. In this evening scene, for example, the snow-covered slopes are casting shadows to the far right. Therefore, we know that we are viewing Mount Hira from the southwest. Hiroshige's understanding about atmospheric perspective is equally impressive. By eliminating details in his rendering of the Karasaki pine tree, he is able to emphasize the intensity of the rain in the foreground. His light gray, uniform treatment of the sky further strengthens the impression that we are viewing a night scene in which the rain clouds are reflecting a great deal of ambient light. As we look through the rest of the series, these two qualities, the effective use of shading and the intense sense of spatial depth, are difficult to ignore. In almost every area of each composition, Hiroshige uses the gradation of tone or hue, known in Japanese as bokashi, to emphasize the vastness of the landscape. Around the same time that he published the 8 Views of Omi, Hiroshige also released another of his crowning achievements, the Hoedo version of the 53 Stations of the Tokaido. In the way that the works radiate with humor, they closely follow the precedent set by the author Jippensha Ikku. but Hiroshike's use of pictorial storytelling is uniquely his own. Here, for example, two young travelers are passing by a brothel in the town of Goyu. Some madams standing in front of the establishment are interested in the men's patronage, but hardened by economic circumstances, they have abandoned hopes of enticing them to enter. Instead, the women assault the fellows and drag them against their will into the bordello. To the right, two prostitutes watch the struggle with disinterest, as if this scuffle was business as usual for them. To emphasize the humor of such slapstick scenarios, Hiroshige simplifies the features of his figures and exaggerates their gestures. These qualities are hallmarks of toba-e, a style of Japanese painting and printmaking popular during the 19th century. Like the sketchbooks of Hokusai, which we discussed in the previous video, toba-e heralded the development of modern Japanese comics in the early 20th century. Here, a man traveling through the plains of Yokkaichi chases his hat, which has been blown off his head by a gust of wind. The humor in many other scenes from the 53 stations of the Tokaido is far more subtle. In this scene of Kakegawa, which, like Yokkaichi, is known for its strong winds, kites can be seen hovering in the sky. One seems to have escaped the grip of its owner and now wanders freely through the air. Closer to us, another kite has risen so high that it penetrates the top border of the print. Hiroshige released at least two versions of this series. The first, co-published by Hoeido and Senkakudo, and the second, with some of the scenes substantially revised, published solely by Hoeido shortly thereafter. Some of the compositional differences between the two versions are intriguing. The first print in the series, for example, depicts Nihonbashi Bridge in Edo, and in his revision of this image, Hiroshige added several more people to the composition, emphasizing the area's bustling traffic. Another example of how this series evolved can be seen in Hiroshige's view of Kambara Station. In the original image, seen on the left, the artist gradates the tone of the sky, darkening it as it approaches the horizon. A later version of the print reverses the direction of that bokashi effect, thereby emphasizing the snow's reflective quality. The 53 stations of the Tokaido enjoyed such popularity upon its release that Hiroshige's contemporary Utagawa Kunisada released a parody about a decade later. As if Hiroshige's images were empty stage sets, Kunisada, who specializes in actor portraits, added a beautiful woman to the foreground of each landscape. Here, Kunisada's model sits astride a bull at Kambara Station. And to Hiroshige's scene of Oiso Station, which is famous as the home of a heroine from the epic Tale of the Soga Brothers, Kunisada places that character in the foreground. Hiroshige spent much of the following decades essentially competing with himself. The Hoeido version of 53 Stations of the Tokaido garnered such phenomenal commercial and critical reception that the artist felt compelled to produce about 30 alternate versions of the series in a wide variety of formats, some postcard-sized, others fan-shaped, but sadly none achieving the same success as his original publication. In the final series of his life, he decided instead to focus upon the landmark sites of his hometown of Edo. Lo and behold, the series 100 Famous Views of Edo received as much acclaim as the Tokaido Prince published by Hoedo. Rallying his strength in all aspects of his role as a designer, Hiroshige selected locations with spectacular urban architecture or vibrant natural beauty, and depicted them in emotionally evocative compositions. Above all else, though, he ensured the scenes were lit in a mesmerizing fashion and displayed a profound spatial depth. As with his Tokaido prints, he created multiple versions of particular compositions. For this scene of prostitutes crossing the Sumida River by ferry, one rendition is set during the day, and a more haunting version depicts a nocturnal voyage. Even some of the most popular selections from this series were printed in alternative colors. Plum Estate Kameido is famous for its fiery orange sky, but the artist also produced a lesser-known, almost monochromatic version. In order to maximize his depth of field, Hiroshige depicted several scenes from impossible vantage points. Fukugawa, Sasaki, and Jumatsubo, for example, is literally shown from a bird's eye view. Other scenes in the series also employ a high vantage point. Fireworks at Ryogoku Bridge, Nihonbashi clearing after snow, and Surugacho, which, in a nod to his rival Hokusai, includes a dramatic glimpse of Mount Fuji. Earlier, we commented upon Hiroshige's use of Western art techniques such as chiaroscuro shading and atmospheric perspective. In this series, we see in multiple examples the artist's command of linear perspective. Equally impressive is his spectacular use of foreshortening. By the standards of Japanese art produced in the 1850s, his grasp of Western art techniques was remarkable. But above all else, we again return to his emphasis upon light and space. The spiritual power of Fudo Falls, a sacred site in Oji, is underscored by the way that the waterfall appears to be backlit. And this scene of foxes celebrating New Year's Eve likewise exudes a supernatural charm, because a floating flame illuminates each of the creatures, and because, if you look carefully, hundreds of other will-o'-the-wisps can be seen similarly trailing off into the distance. Hiroshige died before the series was published, and his pupil, Hiroshige II, with whom he collaborated, had to finish the last few prints on his own. Nevertheless, as proven by this oil painting by the post-impressionist Vincent van Gogh, which was based upon a print from the 100 Views of Edo, Hiroshige was far from forgotten after his death. It's not surprising that a print designer with such a keen sense of visual drama would become an international sensation. Alongside Hokusai, Hiroshige will be remembered for bringing Japanese woodblock prints to the attention of artists and collectors throughout the world. Thanks to them, ukiyo-e is now considered to be an important chapter in the history of Japanese art. In our next video, we will discuss the designer Utagawa Kunisada and the resurgence of interest in kabuki portraiture during the mid-19th century.